Okay, we'll get started. Hi everyone. So it's a pleasure to join you on this course and bringing the expertise we have at NEDPro to the diet and nutrition element of your course as well, so to add to the impact that can have in your communities. To introduce myself, I'm Dr. Luke Buckner. I'm a junior doctor based in the UK with a training in diet and nutrition at King's College London, and currently studying a master's in clinical nutrition at UCL, so University College London. With NEDPro, I hold a number of roles in leadership, from NEDPro Assistant Director and Deputy Lead of our Global Innovation Panel, but also on medical education and our mobile teaching kitchen, which you'll hear about through this course as a case example. And it's allowed me numerous opportunities to visit Kolkata and Punjab to help the communities there through dietary advice. I'm joined today by my colleague Shane, who I'll let introduce himself now, and then we'll get started with the talk.
Thanks, Luke, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be presenting to you today. My name is Shane McAuliffe. I'm a registered dietitian, also based in the UK, and I am a nutrition scientist by training originally. For NEDPro, I work as the Science and Digital Communications Lead, as well as working closely alongside our flagship journal, BMJ Nutrition, Prevention and Health. I also function as the Deputy Co-Lead for our Nutrition and COVID-19 Task Force. And alongside Luke today, I'm looking forward to presenting to you on this topic of dietary adequacy and patterns.
Okay, so to start with, we'll talk through dietary adequacy, and then we'll be followed by Shane's section of the lecture to talk through dietary patterns in the context of the Indian diet. To start with, dietary adequacy is a description of how much you need to eat in the diet of a certain nutrient to avoid deficiency, which is at what point you would develop signs and symptoms of a disease state, essentially, from a lack of intake of that nutrient. This diagram on the right-hand side demonstrates this well, and it's important to note that adequacy is not the same as optimal intake, and so there may well be certain nutrients where eating enough to avoid deficiency does not mean that you're eating enough to have the best health outcomes you could. So in this diagram, if you look on the x-axis, so the line across the bottom of the curve, this is how much of a nutrient you need to eat to avoid deficiency. And if you look at the y-axis, so the line going upwards, you see how many people in the population are fitting on that time point. So what you can see is at the lower reference nutrient intake, so on the dashed line, so the dotted line marked X, 2.5% of the population could consume that amount of the nutrient and avoid deficiency. Whereas if you look at the dashed line with the Y, so the estimated average requirement, that would be 50% of the population. And if you go to Z, the reference nutrient intake, which is often what we use to suggest if someone takes that amount in their diet, they would be in a state where they're not facing deficiency of that nutrient, 97.5% of the population would be covered. But it's important to remember that this needs to take the context of the person in front of you, and it's largely to look at population level intakes. So the individual in front of you may have a disease state, so they may have higher tissue turnover, they may be an extremely large person, a tall person, a muscular person, and therefore need more of a nutrient to sustain their body mass. So dietary adequacy is more than just what is the minimum I can take to avoid deficiency. It needs to take into account the person in front of you, and also remember that it doesn't mean you're consuming an optimal diet. So to start with, let's look at some common nutritional issues. Only recent evidence has shown us that undernutrition is a primer for what you will do later in life with diet. And so when you're coming out of the womb and you're a low birth weight infant, you are actually at higher risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity later in life due to setting your body up ready to accumulate energy and store it in forms which ultimately are not helpful It's particularly true when we get faced with food environments which are heavy in processed foods and high calorie, high fat, high sugar foods, which leads ultimately to those outcomes which I just mentioned. But then again, it also leads to intergenerational changes. So you may then have pregnant women that have gestational diabetes as a risk due to being undernourished themselves as a baby. And that may then lead to another birth environment which impacts the child in their lifespan. This is essentially describing the double burden of malnutrition, which we'll have had a talk from Professor Samantha Ray and Jorgen Johnson earlier in this chapter. But in the Indian context, this is shown through a number of common deficiencies in the diet. So protein energy malnutrition, which is the low intake of protein, but also calories. Micronutrient deficiencies, so that includes vitamin A, iron deficiency anemia, iodine deficiency disorders, and vitamin B complex deficiencies. The iron deficiency anemia and iodine we'll talk about just shortly after as a case example of what that can mean in the diet and why it can be deficient. But vitamin A can lead to immune system issues and issues with your eyesight as well. And vitamin B complex deficiencies, largely these vitamins work to help energy production and metabolism, but also can feed into things such as anemia. All of these dietary deficiencies are more common in urban slums and rural poor communities. And so what that can tell you is that a lot of food availability and things such as your income and education level can really feed into the choices that you can make with your diet and the choices that you ultimately do make. So the first example is protein, which is part of, as I said, that protein energy malnutrition. To start with, protein is essentially a chain of amino acids, which is then absorbed in the body as amino acids themselves or peptides and used to build bodily structures such as muscle and a number of other factors as well. Ultimately, in the Indian guidelines, what they recommend is 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram per day. So as an example of what this means, if we looked at a male weighing 70 kilograms, they would need approximately 56 to 70 grams of protein per day. But a thing to highlight here is that not all sources of protein are equal. So when we're talking about dietary adequacy, sometimes there are multiple layers to what is classed as adequate. So if we're looking on a broad level, then consuming enough protein is where we're looking at an adequate diet. But if we go into more depth, we start looking at which amino acids we're consuming. And there are certain ones out of the 20 amino acids that are used by the body to build structures that are essential to consume through the diet, and others that are not essential and that your body can produce through other means. But to consume enough of the essential amino acids and to get a wide range of others, meat, fish, dairy, and eggs are generally considered complete proteins that cover all of these bases. And plants can also be good sources of protein, but tend to need mixed intakes and a more balanced approach to them to ensure you cover all of the different types of amino acids you need from your diet. So it's important that when you're looking at populations who have higher intakes or higher needs, such as athletes and those with sarcopenia and muscle wasting, you consider whether their plant-based dietary intakes are enough, and also whether they're combining it with things like exercise, which really make that impact into building muscle. Next up, we've got anemia. So this is due to reduced red blood cells in the body, which ultimately are the carriers of oxygen and therefore help you facilitate metabolism throughout your body and produce energy. Their main component is hemoglobin, which is a protein bound to an iron molecule, and that is the carrier of the oxygen in the red blood cell. If you have low red blood cells, so anemia, it can lead to fatigue, breathlessness, pale skin, and feeling faint, to name a few symptoms that can occur due to that, and there are many more, including, in fact, reduced education and also reduced engagement with work, for instance, due to fatigue and tiredness. The causes of which are really important to look at. And when we talk about dietary adequacy, it's important to recognize that sometimes it's not just about the diet, but also the environment the body is facing. So those who have chronic infections or disease or are on certain medications may have higher needs for dietary intake than those who are living sort of a healthy state without disease, infection, or medication. In the diet, the main factors for anemia are iron, B12, and folate, and they work in different ways, but iron's a good example again of feeding back into some of those similar concepts of not all sources of protein being equal, much the same, not all sources of iron are equal. And if you consume iron from meat, it's absorbed in the heme form, which is iron molecule bound to a protein and is absorbed straight through the intestine. Whereas if it's from a plant source, it's non-heme iron, where it requires a different process in the intestine to essentially convert it into a format that the receptor recognizes and can take through the cells. So non-heme sources can significantly reduce the effectiveness of absorption of iron. And to change this, there's a number of factors each way that can improve your absorption or actually hinder it. So in vegetarian or vegan populations, if you consume cups of tea or coffee with your meal, then it contains lots of tannins and phytic acid, which can bind to the iron molecule and stop it being absorbed as easily. Whereas if you consume it with vitamin C containing foods, that actually frees it up from a lot of the binding substances and allows it straight, easy conversion through to the intestinal cells and into the body. So again, looking at dietary adequacy, it's not as simple as just looking at iron levels, and diet is therefore quite a complex thing that you need to look at the holistic picture. Looking at iodine next, iodine's an interesting dietary factor to consider because deficiency can lead to very significant effects in pregnancy in particular. So the child can face reduced growth, a low IQ in later life, or in fact even mental disability. And even things like goiter in adults can still occur as well as children, significantly affecting their thyroid function. But the interesting thing about iodine is that ultimately it depends where you live as to whether your diet even could be adequate in iodine. So those living by the sea, consuming seafood and crops that are developed from soils near the seaside, potentially could get enough iodine in the diet. Whereas most people living inland or up high in the mountains cannot really get anywhere near those sort of levels of iodine that are required to avoid these conditions. And so it's important that we come up with public health interventions to tackle this, to avoid this situation where we could have lots of child death due to pregnancy defects. And as I said, things such as low IQ, which ultimately can hinder an economy in the longer term. So many governments in these areas which are endemic with iodine deficiency look at ways that they can do that. And one of which is to look at simply giving out iodine supplements or tablets. But a great and useful way to do it with very little inconvenience to the population is to put it into the salt. And so anything that is containing salt should be iodized. And therefore, when people put that in their meal, they consume enough iodine to avoid these deficiency states. So how big an issue are these things that I've been telling you about? Well, in India, from the statistics I could find, the most recent ones I found at least, 20% of males and approximately 50% of women still face anemia. And that's not just inadequate levels of iron. This is to the point where they're now in a disease state of iron, B12, or folate. This, again, as I said, leads to large levels of the population, therefore, living a life where they're fatigued all the time and have other symptoms and signs which hinder their daily activities. Iodine deficiency, again, is significant. So 10% of the population have deficiency in iron, and that's not even to take into account the levels where it may just be insufficient. And what could we do if we really turned all of these factors around and had a diet that was not only adequate in all the micronutrients, but consumed the food groups that allowed us to have a healthy diet and avoided things such as overnutrition, so consuming processed foods, high fat, high sugar foods. Well, ultimately, you can see in this graph on the left-hand side, it's probably best to illustrate it. We look at Asia and Pacific, or even the average on the far left, you can see that by including all of those different colors, which are the good factors essentially, then you could reduce your risk by using the Eat Lancet report, for instance, by 25% of premature death. So that's really significant. It doesn't even take into account the use of medications or lifestyles. So exercise, for instance, or getting the right amount of sleep. So you can see here that the reduction in early death can be really well driven by diet, and therefore something that we should be looking at, yes, to focus on reducing inadequacy in the diet, so the vitamins and minerals, but also looking at making sure we consume the right amounts of other foods. And so that feeds into the dietary patterns data, which Shane's going to talk to you about shortly. But it's important, again, to remember that not all people have access to the foods that we recommend. And so it's not just about talking through dietary patterns, but also setting the context of food fairness and availability. So distributing foods within communities and families equally, so that vulnerable groups don't have to suffer with worse diets, be that high fat, high sugar, or even inadequate energy and inadequate vitamins and minerals. Also to remember that large proportion of Indian population's diets, and increasingly across the world actually, are plant-based, and so have lower nutrient bioavailability than some of the milks and meat sort of based diets. So it's important to remember that and just keep it in the back of the mind to encourage different ways to make sure they still reach dietary adequacy. Again, lastly, as I said, diets including high amounts of fat and sugar are increasingly being consumed, particularly by high income groups, but also there's often disproportionate exposure to those who have low income of these high fat, high sugar diets. And so prevalence of disorders like obesity and heart disease are increasingly rising, as is cancer. And it's important that we, as I say, not only strive for adequacy, but also get optimization of the diet. So I'll pass over to Shane now to talk through dietary patterns and why food is more than just nutrition. And so I'll hand over to Shane at this point.
Thanks a lot, Luke, for setting the scene so well for my portion and covering the basis of dietary adequacy as well as some nutrients of concern, which will feed nicely into the section that I'm due to talk about. As you saw on the previous slide, what Luke has highlighted is the Indian dietary guidelines outlined by the National Institute of Nutrition in India. And what these guidelines allow us to do is translate some of the complex scientific knowledge that Luke has discussed in his presentation and make that into practical and accessible guidelines for the population. So these guidelines are outlined in 15 key steps, which I will walk you through now. The first guideline is to eat a variety of foods to ensure a balanced diet. What you will see on the right-hand side here is the Indian Dietary Guidelines food pyramid. In India, foods are conventionally grouped into 4 groups: cereals, millets, and pulses, which provide a majority of nutrients in many Indian diets. Vegetables and fruits, which are encouraged to be eaten liberally, as they provide high levels of vitamins and minerals, or what we term micronutrients. Milk and milk products, as well as other animal sources such as eggs, meat, and fish, as outlined by Luke, are very important sources of protein and also key vitamins and minerals such as vitamin B12. Milk and milk products tend to be an important focus in vegetarian diets where they are permitted to help support some of the nutrients of concern that may not be provided in plant-based diets alone, as Luke has outlined previously. The last group, oils, fats, and seeds, can be an important source of calories for those who are suffering from undernutrition, as well as providing a vessel for fat-soluble vitamins. The second guideline speaks about ensuring nutrition adequacy for pregnant and lactating women. As Luke has described in his presentation, focusing on good nutrition through pregnancy is important for both mother and child, and the consequences of malnutrition can be detrimental for children in terms of low birth weight, as well as contribute to high maternal mortality. There are a number of micronutrients that we focus on to ensure healthy pregnancies. Folic acid, which is recommended to be supplemented through preconception right through pregnancy, prevents the development of neural tube defects. Iron is an important consideration as deficiency can contribute to poor cognitive development as well as childhood and infant mortality. Calcium and vitamin D ensures good bone health and achieving growth potential. Vitamin A contributes to, deficiency contributes to infant mortality as well as issues with eyesight. And vitamin B12, as cited by Luke, is a potentially concerning nutrient in vegetarian diets, and for that reason needs to be replaced or supplemented to ensure efficient energy metabolism. Something we cannot forget as a very basic principle is the risk brought by foodborne illness through eating contaminated food products, and this should be an important point of focus during pregnancy too. The next guideline, with a focus on infants, is to promote exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months and up until 2 years alongside complementary foods to ensure optimal growth and development. This is recommended for all nations by the World Health Organization, and the reason being is that breast milk contains all essential nutrients that are needed for an infant, as well as providing a whole host of additional benefits. These include providing maternal antibodies to the infant, which help to support the development of a healthy immune system, improving cognitive development, provision of beneficial bacteria, which help to support the development of a healthy gut microbiome, or the bacteria that live in our gut, which are related to a number of health outcomes as we continue to learn more about. Also, we have the opportunity to develop maternal-child bond and promote maternal health in terms of risk of diseases like breast cancer and also maternal fertility. We know that breastfeeding in India is quite common among rural and urban poor, but as the country starts to become, or pockets of the country become more affluent, we know that breastfeeding becomes a little less common and perhaps is replaced by formula feeding. Despite this, the guidelines still recommend that exclusive breastfeeding up to 6 months is the goal and the recommendation, with complementary foods introduced at this stage. The reason for this is to help support the baby's growing needs after 6 months, and the introduction of semi-solid foods and additional liquids will help to support this. Complementary foods are generally introduced from 6 months, and as mentioned, can be liquid foods such as milk or semi-solids. Many of these can be prepared from standard ingredients at home, including common examples like you'll see here on the right, with ingredients such as rice, dal, and spices and nuts commonly used in other recipes. Again, food hygiene is an important consideration when preparing these foods from home. Next, as we move into childhood and adolescence, nutrition and physical activity are essential components to ensure healthy childhood development. This is to ensure that growth potential is met, to ensure that we control body weight and body mass targets, and also reduce the potential for infectious disease. Growing children and adolescents need plenty of calcium to help them achieve healthy and optimal bone mass, and therefore recommendations for this are high in these populations. We also know that common childhood infections such as diarrhea, measles, and pneumonia are closely related to malnutrition and contribute to high levels of mortality in younger age groups. Fluid and electrolyte losses are particularly concerning in cases of infectious disease, and a remedy for this, as outlined in the guidelines and used widely, is what's known as oral rehydration solution. And this, provided alongside good nutrition, can contribute to reducing morbidity and mortality from these diseases. Rehydration solution can easily be prepared at home with common ingredients like salt, a teaspoon of sugar, and safe drinking water. The next guideline is around fruits and vegetables. And as mentioned previously, these provide rich sources of micronutrients, as well as numerous other beneficial compounds that exist in plants. These help to promote a healthy immune system, healthy aging, and also benefits to things like bowel health, reduction in cholesterol through fiber, and are naturally low in calories. The recommendations are to eat at least 300 grams per day of vegetables and also regularly 100 grams of fresh fruits. The key message here is that variety is key, and eating lots of different sources of fruits and vegetables will ensure that we achieve a wide array of nutrient guidelines. The next recommendation is around the use of oils and animal foods, in particular animal fats such as ghee, butter, and vanaspati. Fats are an essential component of the diet, and much like Luke spoke about essential amino acids with protein, we also have essential fatty acids, which we need to obtain through our diet. Fats also act as a medium for fat-soluble vitamins, namely vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. They make up a component of cell membranes and, as mentioned previously, are a rich source of energy. We know that there are different types of fatty acids, grouped broadly as saturated, mainly coming from animal sources, as well as coconut and palm oil. These saturated fatty acids are generally recommended to be consumed in lower amounts in the diet, as we know that they are associated with increasing risk of heart disease. On the other hand, we have unsaturated fatty acids, and these are primarily of plant origin, such as seed oils, and also fish being an abundant source of unsaturated fatty acids. The advice is to replace saturated or animal sources of fat with unsaturated for the benefits of cardiovascular health. Next is the advice to avoid overeating and aim to prevent overweight and obesity and its complications. We know that across the world, the prevalence of overweight and obesity is rising, and in India, it is expected to more than triple over a period of 30 years. We know that people who live with overweight and obesity are at increased risk of chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and cancers, as well as some others. Generally, the recommendation for body mass index, or a measure of weight for height, is to range from 18.5 to 25 as being a normal target. For those of Asian ethnicity, BMI cutoffs are lower, between 18.5 and 23. This is because we know that even at lower BMI, Asian populations tend to have higher body fat percentage, and hence this recommendation. Another important component of this would be exercise and staying physically active to help maintain ideal body weight, as well as bring a whole host of additional benefits not associated with wealth, or with weight rather, including improvements in mental health, reduction in chronic disease risk, and increased strength and physical function. These guidelines range from 45 to 60 minutes for adults and children, as well as 30 minutes for pregnant women. The next guideline advises restricting salt intake to a minimum. And this is because we know that salt is associated with high blood pressure and also heart disease. Because much of the salt in our diet is already present through food processing methods, aiming to eat a diet based on minimally processed foods will help to reduce our sodium intakes. Salt should not be consumed at more than 6 grams per day, And it's important to balance our intakes of salt-containing foods with potassium-containing foods, such as fresh fruit and vegetables, which will help to manage the effects on blood pressure. Important, as Luke mentioned earlier, to note that where salt is used, fortified salt can be an important way of including nutrients like iron and iodine in the diet. We know that in India, salt intake varies hugely, but a large proportion of the population do consume far above the recommendations. And lots of this comes from preserved and processed foods, such as pickles, canned foods, and sauces and ketchup. Ensuring the use of safe and clean foods is the next recommendation. And the reason being is that unsafe and unsanitary foods are a major cause of foodborne disease in India. Looking out for food quality, we have a number of certification marks which indicate that food is of a safe and sustainable quality for consumption. So familiarizing ourselves with these is also an important point. Related to this, we have cooking and processing methods to ensure food safety. Common food beliefs can influence dietary patterns and contribute to restrictive food behaviors. This ranges from traditional beliefs around certain fruits and vegetables and negative outcomes in pregnancy, which do not have a scientific basis. Dietary restriction during infection, which I hope we have made clear is likely to aggravate rather than help with malnutrition, and vegetarianism and other practices based on religious grounds, ensuring that we have adequacy in restrictive patterns through, for example, vitamin B12 consumption in milk or supplements if a vegetarian diet is being followed. We also know that appropriate cooking and food preparation promotes everything from taste to digestion to food safety and quality. Ensuring adequate hydration is particularly important, given that water accounts for a large proportion of our body weight and also a number of body functions. On average, we need about 8 glasses or 2 liters of water per day, knowing that hot weather, exercise, and illness can increase this requirement. Ensuring safe water is hugely important, and methods such as boiling are a good way to kill bacteria and ensure that water is safe to drink. We've mentioned milk a number of times, particularly in diets that are restrictive and the diets of young people and children, to provide an important source of nutrients. Carbonated and sugary beverages should be consumed in moderation and limited based on their contribution to calorie intake and weight gain. And as touched on by Luke, tea and coffee should be considered around meal times due to the potential to reduce absorption of nutrients like iron. As touched on previously, minimizing the use of processed foods, and particularly those rich in salt, sugar, and fat, should be aimed for, as these contribute to weight gain and many disease states. That's not to say that all food processing is necessarily bad, as we know that food processing increases the availability of foods, the transport of foods, and also distribution and how long they last. What we have seen as populations become more affluent is that processed foods replace traditional cooking methods, and this contributes to some of the negative health effects that we have previously spoken about. What we're looking out for is those foods that are high in fat, salt, and or sugar, which tend to be high in calories but low in nutrients. And some commonly listed foods are below. The final point is around micronutrients-rich foods, in particular in the diets of our elderly populations, to help them to age healthily. The reason for this is that older populations tend to have higher requirements for a number of micronutrients, which help to prevent age-related diseases and infectious diseases and promote healthy aging. And some of these nutrients are listed here. The reason for this is as we age, our immune system becomes less competent and needs extra help through nutrition to support it. We also commonly see a reduction in food intakes due to changes in taste and smell. We see reduced nutrient absorption and also social issues, including food access, preparation, and other problems, meaning that older populations are more vulnerable to malnutrition. That concludes our session today on dietary adequacy and patterns. I hope that you have learned something from it, and thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the presentations in this module.